Welcome back to our international talk show, Briggs on Books. Look at this book. You're going to want to read this. Add this to your list. Put it in your stack. Let's see, Three Brave Hearts, Traces of My Uncles in the Great War. By the way, the author's here too, so stand by. She's Scottish. She's from Scotland, and she learned a little bit about her uncle, and she did a bunch of research, and she found multiple uncles. I think, well, let's just bring in Liz. Liz Middleton. Welcome, Liz.
Hello, Mike. Thank you very much for having me on your show. I'm delighted to be here.
Tell us a story about your uncles and your research and how the book came about.
Okay, perhaps if I start at the beginning. In 1964, a tantalizing and yet terrifying scenario was set for life. Right. What happened? A letter arrived at our Broughty Ferry home, addressed to Louis Middleton. Who is Louis Middleton? I inquired. Your uncle, Elizabeth. What uncle? I continued. Daddy's brother, replied my mother. What brother? I persisted. And so, as I say, a tantalizing and yet terrifying scenario was set for life.
Wow.
Trapped in... Yeah?
Now, wait, how old were you about this time?
I was 16.
Anyway, go ahead. You got me on the edge of my seat. I love these kinds of stories.
Okay. Well, trapped in a familiar taboo on discussing painful subjects, I retreated into my father's forbidding yet fragile silence and my mother's protective stoicism. Why was this uncle missing? Was this missing relative mad? Was his madness hereditary? Why had I never heard of him? Desperate for information, at the same time I was terrified of the truth. Poking about in a cupboard, I found a Gordon Highlander's bonnet and a medal. What was it all about? So that was the beginning of my journey.
Oh my goodness! And now, you're from Scotland? I know. Tell our guests where you are right now.
Well, I am right now. Okay. I'm a retired orthoptist. I used to work with people with eye disorders, latterly specializing in people with psychosomatic eye disorders, which I subsequently discovered was perhaps unconsciously motivated by the fate that befell my uncle, this uncle that I refer to. Because for years and years and years, I tried to find out about him. My father never spoke of his brother.
He didn't want to talk about it, right?
No, for whatever reason. I can only speculate what the reasons were, but my father never talked about it. And then after he died, I said to my mother, did Daddy ever visit Uncle Louis? And my mother said, no, it upset him too much. And I never did discover who was upset too much, whether it was my father or my uncle. But throughout my life, I persisted in trying to find out more about him. I had an auntie who was a retired nursing sister, and she was a bit more forthcoming about her brother. And I discovered that he'd fought in the First World War, and he'd suffered the fate that terrified many men in the trenches. That was being caught up in shell fire and being buried alive. But he managed to extricate himself and carry on, and he went on to fight at the Battle of the Somme.
Now you are in the UK right now. Where are you located?
I'm in London. I'm in Notting Hill in London.
Notting Hill,
and I've been living in London for quite a long time now.
Tell our viewers where you grew up.
Well, I grew up in a place called Broughty Ferry on the east coast of Scotland, which is just outside Dundee. And on a clear day, you can see over the River Tay to St Andrews, who your golfing viewers may be familiar with. So it was very much golfing territory. I grew up
golfing.
On the Links coast.
Now tell us about the research. It seems like you had to do a tremendous amount of research for this book.
Yes, I did, because eventually I discovered that he was in a psychiatric hospital, and he'd been there, poor man, since the end of the First World War and spent the next 50 years of his life there. I approached the hospital, and in spite of me being a health professional, I didn't make any headway. And eventually I persisted. Well, I kept persisting, and by coincidence my brother moved to the west coast of Scotland where this hospital is, so I was in that area quite a lot. Until eventually I took the last letter that my Uncle Louis wrote to my grandparents before he left for France, going to the Somme. And they had a museum in this hospital, and I produced the letter in front of the archivist, and within minutes she had his case notes in front of me that I tried for years to find out. The case notes in themselves didn't reveal a great deal, just what temperature he had and how much he'd been eating that day and so forth. But just gradually, bit by bit, of doing things like that, I put together various bits of information.
Wow. Amazing. And you're able to put together the book. Now, that's one uncle, but you said maybe the book is about multiple uncles?
Yeah, there's 3 in total that I look at. The next one that's linked to my Uncle Louis is another one also called Louis. Now, Louis is not a very common name in Scotland. It's a slightly regal-sounding name. The other uncle had a rather mysterious upbringing. He came from the part of the family in, I don't know if you've heard of Balmoral Castle, where the royal family go for the summer holidays. Well, this part of my family came from across the road from Balmoral Castle, and Balmoral Castle in the Victorian times was a local employer. Now, I had a great uncle who worked for the royal family for Queen Victoria, and to cut a long story short, my uncle and his wife were sent to Canada as royal servants to Princess Louise, who was Queen Victoria's artistic daughter, and they came back to this country with a child, and according to my auntie, Auntie Maisie, the dates didn't fit. So the story always in the family that this was Princess Louise's illegitimate son. Yeah.
Right.
So they hit that was Louis Thompson, and his mother and wife were French, and he eventually went to live in France. So I have a lot of French cousins, and the same belief is held in the French part of the family that he was Princess Louise's son. Now he became, Princess Louise funded him to study medicine in London, and he joined the French army, and in 1915 he volunteered to serve in Serbia, where the First World War started. And there was a terrible pandemic, typhus pandemic, and he and his unqualified wife went as a nursing assistant, and they tended to the sufferers of Serbia, of typhus in Serbia. And subsequently, and it was a terrible disease, there was no cure for it, but they managed to fare well, and they looked after these people. And then when the Austrian army approached, this uncle and aunt escaped over the mountains of Montenegro and Albania to the Adriatic, and went back to France, and he continued to live a long and fruitful life in Burgundy as a country doctor.
Liz, I could talk to you all day because this fascinates me. They only give us about 10 or 12 minutes, but if I read this book, am I going to learn about Scotland, about World War I, about France? What's the big takeaway from the book?
Well, you'll read about them all, actually, because there was also, say, a third uncle, and you'll learn a bit about the agricultural area my family came from, and you'll see a mixture of tragedy, because the first uncle I mentioned suffered such a severe shell shock. He was a medical student pre-war, and he ended up in a psychiatric institution because he's so severely shell shocked. The second uncle, my great uncle James, was killed at Ypres, probably gassed. It was just after gas was introduced to the war. But the third one ended up, I mean, he was essentially a war hero, if you like. They were all heroes in their own way. But the third one continued to live a long and fruitful life. So there's quite diverse approaches to looking at the First World War.
Yeah. Well, I love to study history, but this would be a study of a period through people, how they lived and what happened to them and their outcomes and how they ended up. It's a way different look, a way different way to study this period. I'm looking forward to reading the book, Liz.
Great. Well, I hope you enjoy it and find it interesting, Mike.
I will. I'm already fascinated by it. I will say this to our viewers. By the way, where can they get the book? On Amazon and all those places?
Yeah. Amazon's the best way to get it.
Yeah. To our viewers, don't go and click one time on Amazon. Click 5 times. Order 5 copies. And I love to get books and give them away to people. I have to go to house parties, and you always want to take a gift. So books are great, but all my family have recently discovered that we're Scottish, almost 100%, and so we're really reading about Scotland. So this will be a great take on Scotland, Liz. I'm glad you wrote the book. Any last thoughts for our viewers about the book or about you or anything else you want to talk about?
I mean, difficult to know what's relevant. It's just that this underlying story, I think, unconsciously created the idea for me that working in an eye clinic, when I worked in the eye clinics, it was very much looking at physical eye symptoms, and there were patients coming from at that time war zones like Rwanda and Lebanon, with strange symptoms that you couldn't account for physically. So it promoted my research into psychosomatic eye disorders, and I think that kind of unconsciously connected me to my first uncle that I referred to.
Yeah,
suffered so
psychosomatic.
badly.
Your uncle. Fascinating, Liz. Thank you for coming. I hope you'll come on the show again, because you're the kind of guest I like to have on, of course, our international talk show. And we love to have international guests. And what a great story. And I'm so glad you wrote it down. If you didn't write it, it would have been lost for history, I'm sure.
Well, thank you very much, Mike, for inviting me. It's been really enjoyable and interesting, and thank you.
Thank you. And for our viewers, stick around, because we've got another author coming up right after this.